The music swelled as guests rose to their feet, smiling, phones lifted, ready to capture the perfect ending to a perfect day. That was when a single voice cut through the room, clear and trembling at once. "Dad, stop. Please don't marry her." Gasps rippled across the hall. Heads turned. The bride froze at the altar. The groom's smile vanished as he looked down the aisle and saw his daughter standing there, eyes shining with something far stronger than fear. She hadn't planned to speak so loudly. In her mind, the words had always been quieter, spoken in private, somewhere far from chandeliers and cameras. But moments like this didn't wait for comfort. They demanded courage. As she stepped forward, the room felt too bright, too exposed. Every step echoed years of silence she had carried alone. She remembered when she first felt something was wrong. It wasn't a single moment, but a series of small things that didn't fit. Stories that changed slightly. Calls that ended too quickly when she entered the room. A smile from the bride that never reached her eyes. People told her she was being protective, emotional, jealous, even. She told herself the same, until the doubts refused to stay quiet. Growing up with a wealthy father meant growing up around appearances. Everything looked polished from the outside. Problems were solved discreetly. Questions were discouraged. Love came wrapped in gifts instead of time. She had learned early how easy it was for truth to get lost when comfort demanded silence. The bride turned toward her now, laughing lightly as if this were a harmless interruption. "She's nervous," she said to the guests. "Big days do that." A few people chuckled, relieved to be given permission to relax. But the daughter didn't laugh. She looked straight at her father, searching his face for recognition. He stared back, stunned. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, not angry, just confused. That confusion hurt more than shouting would have. She took a breath and kept going, because stopping now would mean losing everything she had worked for. "I wouldn't do this if it wasn't important," she said. Her voice steadied as the truth pressed forward. "I tried to talk to you before. You didn't want to hear it." Murmurs spread through the guests. The bride's smile tightened. She explained how she had started looking into the woman who was about to become her stepmother. Not out of spite, but out of instinct. Names that didn't match. Stories that didn't align. A past that seemed to reset every few years. Each discovery had made her stomach sink a little more. She reached into her bag and felt the familiar weight of the folder inside. She hadn't planned to pull it out here. But plans change when the cost of waiting becomes too high. The room felt like it was holding its breath. "This isn't about ruining a wedding," she said softly. "It's about protecting you." Her father flinched at that word. Protecting. He had always been the one doing that, or so he believed. The bride stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm, whispering something meant only for him. The daughter watched carefully, noticing how quickly comfort turned into control. That was when she knew she was doing the right thing. She stood there, in the middle of a room filled with wealth and expectation, knowing that once the next words left her mouth, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. And even though her hands were shaking, her resolve wasn't. The truth had waited long enough. The silence that followed felt heavier than the music ever had. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look at the altar or the young woman standing in the aisle. The bride's hand tightened around the groom's arm, her voice low and urgent as she whispered reassurance meant to sound loving. There was tension there now, a sharp edge that hadn't been present before. The father raised his hand, asking everyone to wait. His eyes never left his daughter. "You should have come to me," he said, struggling to keep his composure. "Not like this." She nodded slowly. She had expected that response. She had rehearsed it in her head more times than she could count. "I tried," she replied, her voice steady but honest. "I tried when it was easy. I tried when it was private. You didn't want to hear it then. And today, there's no more time." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer an awkward interruption. It was something deeper. She spoke about the first name she found that didn't match. Then another. She explained how each search led to more questions, not answers. Addresses that changed too often. Stories that shifted depending on who was listening. She didn't accuse. She described. That difference mattered. The bride laughed again, louder this time, trying to reclaim the room. "This is ridiculous," she said. "She's upset because things are changing." But her laughter didn't spread. It fell flat, landing in the silence without support. Her eyes darted around, searching for allies. The father looked from the bride to his daughter, torn between the woman he loved and the child he trusted with his life. "Do you have proof?" he asked quietly. The question wasn't defensive. It was desperate. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. It wasn't dramatic. No flourish. Just paper, worn at the edges from being handled too often. She walked forward and placed it gently in his hands. He hesitated before opening it, as if the weight alone told him what was inside. As he flipped through the pages, his expression changed. Confusion gave way to concern. Dates lined up too neatly. Photos told stories words couldn't undo. The bride's voice grew sharper, her reassurances turning into protests. She insisted there was an explanation for everything. But explanations came too quickly now, rehearsed and rushed. The father closed the folder slowly. He didn't look at the bride right away. He looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. At the exhaustion in her eyes. At the resolve it must have taken to stand there, risking everything for him. The room waited. Breath held. Future hanging on a decision that could no longer be postponed. And in that moment, it became clear that this wedding was no longer about love or celebration. It was about truth finally stepping into the light, refusing to be ignored any longer. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved closer the moment the folder closed. No one whispered anymore. No one checked their phone. Every eye was fixed on the father as he stood there, holding pages that had quietly rewritten his future. The bride broke the silence first, her voice tight, controlled, insisting that everything had been misunderstood. She spoke quickly, stacking words on top of each other, hoping speed could replace truth. He raised a hand, not to silence her, but to steady himself. He asked her simple questions, direct ones, about dates, about names, about places she had claimed were part of her past. Each answer came with a pause that grew longer than the last. The confidence she had worn so easily began to slip, replaced by irritation, then fear. The daughter stayed where she was. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She watched her father process something she had already carried alone for months. That patience was its own kind of strength. She knew this wasn't about winning. It was about allowing him to see clearly, even if it hurt. When the bride realized charm was no longer working, her tone changed. She accused the daughter of manipulation, of jealousy, of wanting to control her father. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The words sounded familiar, rehearsed, like defenses used before. The daughter felt a brief sting, but it passed. She had expected this too. The father turned to his daughter then and asked one question that mattered more than all the rest. Why didn't you give up? His voice cracked on the last word. She swallowed and answered honestly. Because losing you would hurt more than standing here. That was when something in him broke open. Not anger, not embarrassment, grief for the time he had missed, the warnings he had ignored, the trust he had almost misplaced. He took a step away from the altar, then another. The distance between him and the bride was no longer symbolic. It was real. He announced that the ceremony was stopped, not postponed. Stopped. A collective gasp filled the room. The bride protested, her composure fully gone now, but the decision had already settled. He asked for space, for clarity, for truth without performance. Guests were quietly escorted out, conversations muted, faces stunned. What had been planned as a celebration dissolved into something far more honest. When the room finally emptied, only 3 people remained. A father, a daughter, and a truth that could no longer be undone. He turned to his daughter and pulled her into an embrace that felt overdue. No cameras, no audience, just relief and regret mixed together. You saved me, he said softly. She shook her head. I just didn't want to lose you. And in that quiet, stripped of wealth and ceremony, something stronger than a wedding began to form. Trust, rebuilt slowly, carefully, but real. The hours after the guests left felt unreal, like time had loosened its grip. The decorations were still there, flowers untouched, chairs neatly aligned, but the purpose they were meant to serve was gone. The father sat heavily in one of the front row seats, hands clasped, staring at nothing. Wealth had always given him options. Tonight, it gave him questions he couldn't avoid. The daughter stood nearby, unsure whether to speak or wait. She had imagined relief, maybe even gratitude, but what she felt instead was a quiet exhaustion. Carrying the truth had taken more out of her than she realized. Still, she stayed. Leaving now would feel like abandoning him halfway through waking up. He finally looked up at her. How long have you known? He asked, not accusing, just tired. She told him the truth. Months, late nights, doubt turning into certainty piece by piece. She explained how hard it had been to accept that the woman he loved might not be who she claimed. How she had hoped to be wrong. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. I should have listened sooner, he said. The admission was quiet, but it mattered. He had built an empire by trusting his instincts, yet ignored the one person who knew him best. That realization hurt more than the public interruption ever could. They talked without rushing, about loneliness, about how success can isolate without warning. He admitted that after years of distance and loss, the attention had felt comforting, familiar. He wanted to believe in it because believing was easier than being alone. Saying it out loud stripped the illusion of its power. Later, security confirmed what the folder had already suggested. The bride had a history of reinventing herself, attaching to people with influence, disappearing when questions grew too loud. Hearing it verified didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity, and clarity, while painful, felt grounding. The daughter listened as he spoke, really listened, in a way she hadn't experienced in years. No distractions, no phone, no impatience, just presence. That alone felt like a victory no one else in the room would ever see. Before they left the hall, he stood and looked around one last time. I almost traded something real for something convenient, he said. She didn't correct him. She didn't need to. He already understood. As they walked out together, side by side, there were no cameras, no applause, no announcement. Just a shared understanding that the hardest part wasn't stopping a wedding. It was rebuilding trust after the music stopped. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to do that work. The next morning arrived without headlines or celebration. Sunlight filled the father's house, touching walls lined with art and awards that suddenly felt decorative, almost hollow. He sat at the kitchen table long after his coffee had gone cold, replaying every moment he had ignored, every question he had brushed aside. Wealth had always insulated him from consequences. This time, it hadn't. The daughter moved quietly through the house, unsure of her place now that the crisis had passed. She wasn't there to lecture or remind him what she had done. Simply existed in the same space, letting him decide what came next. That restraint mattered more than words. He finally spoke, not looking up. "I built everything except the part that mattered," he said. The confession surprised him as much as it did her. He admitted how easy it had been to mistake attention for connection, charm for honesty. He had wanted a future that looked complete, even if it wasn't true. She sat across from him and listened. No interruptions. "No, I told you so." She told him how hard it had been growing up feeling like she had to earn moments of his time. How silence can feel louder than absence. The words weren't sharp, but they cut deeper because they were honest. For the first time, he didn't defend himself. He didn't explain it away. He asked questions instead. Real ones. What she needed. What she had needed back then. The answers weren't simple, but they were finally being heard. Later that day, he made a call. Then another. Not to protect his image, but to close doors that should never have been opened. He cancelled contracts connected to the woman he almost married. He requested quiet investigations, not for revenge, but for accountability. Each call felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. That evening, they shared a meal without staff, without formality. Just two people relearning how to sit across from each other. There were pauses, but they weren't awkward. They were necessary. What surprised him most wasn't the loss he had avoided. It was the relationship he had nearly missed. And as the house settled into silence that felt peaceful for the first time in years, he realized the real cost of that stopped wedding wasn't public embarrassment. It was the years he was determined not to waste again. The days that followed were quieter than he expected. No urgent calls. No scheduled appearances. Just space. At first, the silence unsettled him. He had spent most of his life filling every moment with movement, convinced that stillness meant falling behind. Now, stillness felt like reckoning. He began noticing things he had ignored before. How his daughter preferred mornings, how she took her tea, how she paused before speaking when something mattered. These were small details, but they carried weight. They were reminders of how much of her life he had observed from a distance rather than lived beside her. One afternoon, he asked her to walk with him through the city. No security detail. No polished route. Just sidewalks and people. She agreed, surprised. As they walked, he listened to her stories. Not summaries, but memories. Moments she had never thought to share because she assumed he wouldn't have time. He felt each one like a quiet correction. He admitted how the bride had made him feel seen at a time when he felt invisible in his own life. How flattery had filled gaps he never acknowledged. Saying it aloud stripped it of its power. He wasn't excusing his choices. He was understanding them. She told him about the fear she felt standing up at the wedding. Not fear of embarrassment, but fear of losing him emotionally if he chose not to believe her. That fear lingered longer than the event itself. Hearing that tightened something in his chest. He had always thought of himself as strong. Now he understood how fragile trust could be. That evening, he made another choice. He began adjusting his schedule, not temporarily, but deliberately. Meetings were shortened. Some were cancelled altogether. He created space not because it looked good, but because it was necessary. He wanted his actions to match his promises. For the first time, she believed him. Not because of words, but because of consistency. He showed up when he said he would. He listened without checking his phone. He asked questions without steering the answers. The stopped wedding had felt like an ending to everyone else. For them, it was the beginning of something unfamiliar and fragile. A relationship not defined by wealth or obligation, but by attention. And as uncomfortable as that vulnerability was, neither of them wanted to go back. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came in moments that felt ordinary to anyone watching. A shared breakfast. A late-night conversation that stretched longer than planned. An honest disagreement that didn't end in distance. These were things he once believed he didn't have time for. Now he realized they were the only things that ever mattered. The daughter noticed it too, though she didn't rush to trust it. She had learned that patterns mattered more than promises. Still, each day added weight to something new forming between them. He asked for her opinion before making decisions. Not to test her, but because he valued it. That alone felt unfamiliar. One evening, they sat on the back porch as the city lights flickered in the distance. He spoke about his fears, not as a powerful man, but as a father who almost made a mistake he couldn't undo. He admitted how close he had come to losing not just his fortune but his family. Saying it out loud made it real in a way no document ever could. She told him she didn't want to be his protector. She wanted to be his daughter. The honesty landed gently but firmly. He nodded, understanding what she was asking for. Not control. Not responsibility. Just presence. News of the stopped wedding faded quickly. The world moved on, hungry for the next spectacle. He didn't correct rumors or issue statements. For once, public opinion didn't guide his choices. He focused instead on rebuilding something quieter and more meaningful. He invited her to his office one afternoon, not to impress her, but to show her where he spent so much of his life. He admitted how empty it had felt without anyone to share it with. She walked through the space with fresh eyes, asking questions no one else had ever asked. It reminded him that success without connection was just noise. That night, he thanked her again. Not for saving him, but for trusting him enough to speak when it would have been easier to walk away. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I stayed because I hoped you would choose us." He felt the weight of that choice settle in his chest. The wedding that never happened no longer defined the moment. What defined it now was the quiet work of rebuilding trust. And for the first time in years, he wasn't running from that work. He was committed to it. The following weeks tested everything they had begun to rebuild. Trust, once cracked, doesn't seal itself easily. There were moments when old habits tried to return. His phone buzzing during conversations. Her hesitation before sharing something personal. But instead of ignoring those moments, they named them. Quietly. Honestly. That alone changed the outcome. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to him, forwarded from an old contact. It mentioned the woman he almost married, her sudden disappearance, the trail she left behind. He read it slowly, then set it aside. For the first time, he didn't feel pulled toward the drama of it. He felt detached. Grounded. Whatever that chapter had been, it no longer defined him. He showed the letter to his daughter. Not because he needed guidance, but because he refused to keep secrets again. She read it, handed it back, and said nothing for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. Not in relief, but in recognition. This was what trust looked like. Transparency without fear. They talked about boundaries. About how love doesn't mean access to everything, but respect for what matters. He admitted how easily he had confused admiration for connection in the past. She admitted how hard it had been growing up feeling like she had to earn his attention. The conversation wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. That evening, they attended a small event together. No spotlight. No announcement. Just two people entering a room side by side. Someone asked about the wedding. He answered calmly that it wasn't happening and left it at that. No explanation. No performance. The daughter noticed how little he needed validation now. Later, as they drove home, he thanked her again, but differently this time. "You didn't just stop a mistake," he said. "You helped me see myself clearly." She looked out the window, then nodded. Sometimes acknowledgement mattered more than apology. The miracle wasn't that the wedding ended. It was that something honest began afterward. And as the city lights passed quietly by, both of them understood that this chapter wasn't about what they avoided, but about what they were finally choosing to build. The shift became visible in ways neither of them expected. People who had known him for years began noticing how differently he moved through rooms. He listened more than he spoke. He paused before answering. Decisions that once came quickly now came thoughtfully. Power no longer rushed him. It waited. One afternoon, he invited his daughter to sit in on a meeting. Not as a gesture, but as inclusion. He introduced her simply, without titles or explanations. As the discussion unfolded, he asked for her thoughts. The room stilled, surprised. She spoke calmly, clearly, without trying to impress. Her perspective shifted the conversation in a way no one anticipated. He watched quietly, not with pride alone, but with recognition. This was who she had always been. He just hadn't been looking. Afterward, he admitted something difficult. He said he used to believe protecting his family meant shielding them from discomfort. Now he understood it meant trusting them with truth. The difference felt small, but it had changed everything. That evening, they talked about the future. Not plans written in stone, but intentions. He spoke about slowing down, about choosing presence over momentum. She spoke about her own dreams, ones she had kept modest out of habit. He encouraged them without trying to shape them. That restraint mattered. News resurfaced briefly about the stopped wedding, but it no longer carried weight. When asked, he answered simply and moved on. The story no longer owned him. He had reclaimed it by living differently. What surprised him most was how light he felt. Not because something bad had been avoided, but because something honest had been embraced. He had spent years building a life that looked complete. Only now did it begin to feel whole. As they ended the night, he realized the moment at the altar hadn't been an interruption. It had been an invitation. And accepting it had changed the direction of everything that followed. The final change came quietly, without an audience. Months later, on a calm morning, they shared breakfast the way people do when nothing needs to be proven. No tension. No unfinished arguments hanging in the air. Just ease. That was how he knew something lasting had taken root. He had stepped back from the pace that once defined him. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. Time felt different now. Slower, but fuller. He showed up. For conversations. For small moments that never make headlines but shape a life. His daughter noticed how little he spoke about the past. He wasn't running from it. He had simply learned from it. When people mentioned the wedding that never happened, he didn't flinch. He smiled gently and changed the subject. The chapter was closed, not locked away, just finished. One evening, as they walked together, she thanked him. Not for canceling the wedding, but for listening when it mattered most. He stopped, surprised, then said something simple. You reminded me who I wanted to be. It wasn't dramatic, but it was true. The miracle everyone talked about wasn't the interruption at the altar. It was what followed. A man choosing humility over image. A father choosing connection over control. A family choosing honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. As their lives moved forward, there was no grand declaration, no perfect ending. Just consistency. Respect. Trust rebuilt one ordinary day at a time, and in the end, that was the real miracle. Not a moment that shocked the world, but a choice that quietly changed everything.